Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. So today what we are going to be doing is we are going to be talking about how we properly texture models. In the previous series I made about talking about how to make a basic bathroom scene in Blender, I kind of just showed you how to do UV mapping to texture objects, but I didn't really explain it. And I think it's very important that you understand the basic concept, because a bad UV map leads to a lot of problems down the road for your model, no matter how well you did in the modeling phase. So we're just going to jump right into it. I'm going to try to keep this video as short as possible, but I'm going to try not to skimp out on the important stuff. If you're kind of lost and you're new to Blender, I'd recommend you go check out the bathroom series that I did before, because I'm going to be going pretty fast with this and just talking about the concept. So you can see here we're in a new scene of Blender, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to select everything and delete it, and I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to add back in that basic cube. Now, this cube right here is called a primitive, and if I get rid of it again and show the mesh list, you can see all the primitives that Blender offers. You have basic planes, cubes, circles, UV spheres, cylinders, etc. And the nice thing about these primitives is if I add this cube back and I go down to the cube properties, you can notice there's a generate UVs checkbox right here. And what this does is it automatically generates a UV for our cube that we added, so we can already throw on textures and they'll pretty much work 100% all the way around. Of course, when we start editing our object, we'll have to remap the UVs because it's going to be a completely different object. But you might be wondering, like, what exactly are UV maps? So basically, the way it works in 3D is that you have to take your 3D object and you have to flatten it out into a 2D plane. And then you apply a texture image that will then be wrapped around the cube. And I have a couple examples here for you, so I'm not going to go to that picture yet. So right here I pulled this off Wikipedia, so you can see this looks much like our cube. And basically what is happening is we need to mark the edges of our cube in edit mode, and Blender will, and the edges that we mark, Blender will then try to cut the object and then flatten it out. So you can see here the cube, there's cut lines along these edges right here that I'm mousing over. And then when it flattens out, you have this flat box. And this is similar to when you print out a piece of paper and then you cut out the edges and then you fold it up and you can have like a little 3D box. It's the same process, except we're doing it in reverse. We start with a 3D object and we want to flatten it out. And you'll notice that if we really wanted to, we could cut every single edge and just have a separate face for each separate like UV map for each face, so they don't have to be connected. But the reason we want the faces to be connected as much as possible is because there's these things called seams, which is basically a discontinuation in the texture that gives us problems. It adds that like faint seam on the texture that you can tell when an object's like broken. But I'll go more into that later. So yeah, and you can see another example here is of a 3D sphere. So basically, if you flatten it out into a UV map, which, by the way, a UV map, the terminology is basically because, according to Wikipedia again, because in 3D we already have a Z, X, and Y axis. The U and the V are the texture coordinates for the flattening of the image, basically. Funny enough, though, Blender still refers to the up and down as Y and the right and left to X when you're actually editing it, but just know that the reason it's called a UV map is because we're not using the X, Y, and Z notation, or we're not supposed to. But anyways, you can see here, here's the 3D sphere flattened out, and when we apply a 3D image to it, it'll wrap around the sphere. That's all nice and good, and we'll come back to that other picture later. So I'm going to give you a concrete example in Blender. So remember, we have our cube here. I'm going to delete it and make another one so I can bring back up this option down here. So like I said, we have Generate UVs checked. Now if I go up to the UV Editor panel right here, it'll give us a quick shortcut over to a split view where we have our 3D object on the right and our UV map on the left, which, by the way, you can change that by going up to here, and it is under General, UV Editor. So that's what this is. And you can see here it already cut our cube up just like in our little picture over here that I grabbed from Wikipedia. So you can see here we have this like Minecraft, like Steve looking pose right here. And you can see it looks just like the picture over here. So you can see we already have a UV unwrap for this. So what we can do with this is we can go ahead and apply a texture to it because we already have a UV map. And the way you do that is you do it through these shaders in Blender. So I'm going to do that real quick to kind of give you a better visual representation. So if I come over here to the shader tab, making sure our object is selected, I'm going to add a new shader, and we're not going to worry about all this. All we have to do is come up to shading, the shading tab up here. I'm going to click this, and I'm going to scroll out a bit. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to add the base texture to our model. And the way you do that is you hit Shift A in the node editor, you go down to texture, image texture, and then you just place this right here. And what we're going to do is we're going to hit open. So we're going to open our image texture. And I have a nice little image texture right here. So I'm going to, after we select our image texture, which if I can find it real quick, all it is a square that looks like this. This is the image texture. So after we have imported it, all we have to do is drag this little color node to the base color of the principled shader, and you notice there's that texture I was talking about. So I'm going to go back into UV editing over here, and then I'm going to hold down middle mouse and drag this over, and I'm going to click on this button right here, which will display our textures. And you can see there's the texture that we added. It looks just like, let me reopen this again. You can see it looks just like this map, but it's the boxes are a lot bigger on the cube. And that's because this sorry about that. So basically you can see here that if I bring up that image one more time, sorry I keep closing it, you can see here that our cube outline right here where we have the UV textures unwrapped, it doesn't cover the entire area. So that's one of the drawbacks to UV mapping. Well, it's just kind of like how it works basically, where you can't utilize the space 100% unless you have only giant square faces. But we can do some workarounds with this. So for example, this is kind of like a hacky way to do it, but if I hit A to select all these faces and I scale it up, you'll notice that it starts to, those squares on the right start to shrink. And that's because more and more of the texture space is being consumed. And one thing that's important to note is that these edges that are going off screen, it's just being continuated. I think that's a word. So basically, once it comes up to here, it just loops down to the bottom and then it starts back up again. So you can kind of see it here. So like you can see how the if I go into face select mode, this might be easier to see. Let me see, face select. So you can see, for example, right here, I think it is positioned like this, maybe. Yeah, that looks about right. But you can see how when it cuts off here, there's that seam that's visible. So this texture isn't 100% seamless. You can download seamless textures off the internet or even make your own in Photoshop. But you can see how you got to be careful if your texture is actually going outside the bounds. And I'm going to Control Z this so we can reset our texture back to the center. And one more important thing to note is rotation also obviously takes an effect, because wherever you move this layout, it's going to be affected on the image texture. So for example, if I hit R and I just rotate it, you can see how these cubes are starting to get distorted, and that's because I'm rotating the faces and it's using different references on the image that we imported. So that's pretty cool. But you might be asking, like, hey, how do I actually make my own textures? Well, there's a couple ways you can do it. If you want to be professional about it, you use a program called Substance Painter. That's kind of the industry standard right now for texturing objects. It's pretty easy to drag and drop textures and materials, and it exports them all nice and pretty for you. But for people who are, you know, a bit on a tighter budget, or more of like a hobbyist like me, you can actually make your own textures, and it's not too hard. All you really need is a program like Photoshop or GIMP if you want free software, or even Paint works too. You just have to export it properly. So to give you a quick example how you can easily texture your objects, all you have to do is making sure your object is selected and you're messing with the UV you want to export. If you come up to UV, come down to Export UV Layout and click, you can then save your layout wherever you want, give it a name, And you can see I already did that. If I pull this up, what it will do is it'll export a it's transparent, so you can't really see it here, but it'll export that square image with the faces, so you can get a better reference to what you're actually drawing on or whatnot. So for example, if I put it in Photoshop and I bring this back over here, you can see here's our object, right? And you have to make sure that when you export this image, you're not actually exporting the layout itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the layers panel. I'm going to create another layer. You don't really have to worry about this. I'm just kind of giving you a demo of how you could go about this in Photoshop. So I'm going to lock layer 1. I'm going to select layer 2. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to put a red dot here. And then I'm going to put a blue dot here. Maybe like a blue line here, and a green dash, and then put a black thing there, and then like a weird cross. So there you see I've actually colored each face, and even though it's random, you can see what I'm going at here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the layer and see, now this is our texture layout. So all we have to do now is if I hit File, Save, and I'll save this to my thing right here, so I'm going to label this Texture. And don't worry about all this, I'm just trying to show you how easy it is to edit your own textures. So we're going to come back into Blender, and we're going to go back to the Shading tab, and I'm going to get rid of this UV image, and you'll notice it'll disappear off our cube. I'm going to add in another image texture. I'm going to hit Open, and I'm going to go find that thing that I made. So actually I saved it as a Photoshop file. So let me make sure I save it as like a PNG or something. So go PNG, and we'll leave it named as texture. So let me just reload this. So texture.png. So here's our texture, and then if we take the color and put it in base color, you can see there's our there's all the doodles that I made on the cube. So look at that, it's pretty neat, right? It does look a little bit distorted, and I don't know if that's because of Photoshop or whatnot. We can hop back over to UV edit mode. Yeah, so it looks like there was some weird export with the brushes. I don't know if that was my Photoshop settings or something. But yeah, you get the point. You can see how we have these different colors on each side of the faces, and they all correspond with these faces. So for example, if I select this green one right here, you can see it's the right face. If I jump back over to Photoshop, you can see how it's that green brush stroke that we made. And if I select this face, let's see, it's this one right here. I bring up Photoshop, it's the blue one. So you can see it's pretty simple once you get the hang of it. But obviously you have to understand the workflow behind it too. So I'm going to give you a quick demo of that just to kind of show you how it works. So there's our cube. I'm going to delete it, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in another cube, and I'm going to turn off the generate UVs. So if we go over to the UV editor, you can see we don't have any UVs for this one. So marking the edges is actually pretty simple. You just kind of have to think about it. You just kind of have to pre-plan how you want to actually unwrap your object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop into edit mode. I'm going to select edge select, because this is the you're going to be using edge select mode a lot because you're selecting which edges to cut along. So basically the main goal with UV unwrapping is you want to keep as many faces intact as possible, but you don't want the object to stretch. And what I mean by that is, for example, if I select this edge right here, this edge here, and this edge, and then I go to edge and then mark seam, you'll notice it is now marked as red, so that's labeling. Marking a seam is labeling where we want it to cut. But you'll notice I only really cut the box. So like, for example, might look a little weird, but like, so this face right here will kind of swing up like a box, but all these faces down here are still connected. So what I can do here, I'm going to hit A to select all the faces. I'm going to go to UV and unwrap, and you'll notice when we go to UV editing, see how like weird and contorted it is. And if you really want to see how stretched your UV maps are, you can come up to display here, and you can check the stretch box. And basically blue means that there's basically no stretching at all, or very little. You might be able to see very faint non-blue here. But like the green and yellow means there's really bad stretching going on. So what you need to do is you need to minimize the amount of stretching so your image doesn't get all gunked up. And just to show you how bad this is, if I add back that material texture we made before, you'll notice that, let's select all these faces. I'm just going to rotate it a bit. So you'll notice up here, this was kind of like these three brush strokes here. And you'll notice when I go back into Blender, let me see. So this is that top face that isn't stretched at all. And you see it looks pretty okay. But every other face, there's a lot of like stretching going on and whatnot. And for example, if I grab this center face and I start moving it around, you can see how like that red brush stroke is just getting like dragged into a different dimension. And it's because it's not flayed out nice and flat. So let's go back. Let's deselect all these faces. I'm going to go back into just standard shading mode. And what we're going to do is we're going to quickly cut this out, similar to the way this demo is right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave these top faces marked as sharp. You can kind of see it by that red outline. I'm not sure how well it will come up on the recording. And I'm just going to kind of look at this. So basically, we want to make, so we already kind of have this top face right here, but we need these like side wings popping out. You obviously don't have to do it the exact way I'm doing it, but I'm just trying to follow this example so it's easier to identify. So if this is the top and this is like the left wing that needs to swing out, it's going to need a break here, a break here, a break here, but we don't want to mark a seam here because we want this to stay connected. And you can see the top one staying connected here. So I'm going to select this face, shift click this face, and then I'm going to go to edge and then mark seam. I can't remember the hotkey for this. There's a hotkey, but and then I'm going to do the same on the opposite side. So I'm going to click this face, shift click this face, leaving this one unmarked. I'm going to go to edge, mark seam, and you'll see now we have these two like wings. And then the cool thing is, so you'll notice that if I go back over to the reference, these faces down here are connected. So if this is our top face right here, and it isn't marked here, and it isn't marked here, this will kind of loop down and extend out that like bottom bit. And you'll notice our seams on the edge here should allow us to do this without needing any more seams marked. So let's just double check that I got this all right. So I'm going to hit A, and I'm going to hit UV and unwrap, and you see there's our shape there. So we have, so let me just kind of show you a bit better. So these are those three faces I was talking about. You can see how it kind of loops down here, and it's using those previously marked edges to kind of like swing out a bit. So yeah, and again we can hit A to select all the faces in the UV map if my mouse is over here, and if I hit G to grab it and then I hit X to lock it to the X, we can just shift it over to the center, and there we go. So I don't think it's perfectly centered like our Photoshop picture here, but if we go back into texture mode, you should see our brush strokes are kind of fixed again, even though they were exported strangely from Photoshop. You can kind of get an idea for how you want to go about UV mapping, and it's basically its own art form, because you need good UV maps for like characters and organic shapes. You can also do the hacky way of UV unwrapping if you really don't care. You can hit U or go up to UV here, and if you hit Smart UV Project, Blender will try to guess where to unwrap the faces based off an angle limit. And it isn't very good. You'll notice if I hit OK, it did unwrap all the faces, and since this is a cube, you wouldn't really notice any problems with it, but it doesn't really have them connected in a nice manner like the like this example right here. And another very important aspect about UV unwrapping you need to understand is that you want as many faces connected as possible, because otherwise it causes some weird seams along the edges. And what I mean by that is if I delete this object, I'm going to just drop in a basic plane, and I'm going to shift it along the Y, and I'm going to put a edge loop in the center. And what you could do is you could just unwrap this object right now, and it wouldn't have any problems because it's basically just a plane. But for example, if I wasn't very if I didn't let's say this was like a wall in a video game. If I marked a seam right here, if I go into Edge, mark seam, so now I have a seam in the center. You'll notice when I unwrap now, these objects are now separated. So if I select this face, it moves independently of the other one. And in this case, it's actually fine because they're connected anyways. But for example, let's say this object was a bit more complex and they were a bit offset like this. The reason this would be bad is because let's say we had in a texture. Let's go back to shading, and I'm just going to add in that cube texture that we had before. So UV image, I believe this is it. Yeah, and you'll notice there's a weird cut in our shape, and that's because these faces aren't exactly lined up with each other. So if they were connected, we wouldn't have this problem. So you'll see if I drag this down along the Y and I line it up again, you'll notice I think it's because it's flipped actually. So let's rotate this real quick. Let's see if we get rid of the seam, if that'll fix it. So I'm going to clear seam. I'm going to unwrap it again. And yeah, so notice that weird clipping in the center isn't there anymore, and that's because now our faces are 100% connected. So if I move one, it'll affect the other. So just UV texturing is a very delicate process that you need to take very carefully, and especially with organic objects, you really have to be careful, especially if you have a character with like a face. If their face is super stretched out like this, and you can see all the warping that takes place, it's going to be a lot harder to actually texture your character. Because if you drew a straight line right here, it would curve off like this. And here's a picture that I have for kind of a reference. So you can see right here, this is something I ripped from Uncharted 2, I believe. I just Googled it. And you can see here's a character's face, and you can see where they UV unwrapped it right here with the grid. And when they textured it, you can see how it looks super creepy, but in-game it looks like a regular face, obviously. They also have a normal map for the fake depth, or the fake like displacements, and a reflection map for the like the reflection of the character's face, you know, like pores and whatnot. So yeah, you can see how it can be pretty difficult. And basically, you just kind of want to follow the rule of marking only the sharpest of angles. So like you don't notice texture clipping on a cube because it's a cube. You know, if there's a seam here, it doesn't matter because there's a break in the texture anyways. But you know, if you have like a sphere, there isn't really any sharp edges, so it's going to give you some problems. And again, they do have a generate UVs, and you can see here it looks pretty good except for the top ones are a bit stretchy, but this is the best you're going to get with the sphere. And like another thing, we have a monkey character here, a Suzanne head, and you'll notice that they also have generated UV maps, and you can see how they had to kind of like plan around the character's face to so let's see here, if I select this and we'll go down a bit, maybe I went a little too far. Yeah, and you can kind of see how like they probably had to mark a seam along here since this is like the sharpest part of the character's face. So like all this right here, and select a bit more. So you can kind of see how there's like they had to mark the seams along the sharper edges. Because let's see, if I assign that texture, that, you know, you can kind of see how it'd get a little bit messy, and especially like the top part of the head. If I just kind of show you here real quick, you can see how they're actually like very split in the texture, and when they're so far apart, you can see that splitting of the seam. Now, programs like Substance Painter help minimize this by doing a bunch of like math and using special algorithms to kind of blend it together. Or you could also do this in Photoshop. It'd just be a lot more tedious. You can also do texture painting in Blender, but that's kind of a different subject. But yeah, you can see how it's basically just like a big game of like try to make it look nice. Like, you know, I can select this this ring of faces, and I could go edge, mark seam, and obviously this isn't all the necessary faces, but if I unwrap it, you can kind of see there's the monkey face that I cut out. So it's just a lot of work, especially like places like the nose where it's such like a sharp indent. If you can kind of see that. See, like I select that side of the nose and also selected this side. Also select these bottom ones. So it's just a lot of like fine tuning. But for basic objects like cubes and stuff, it's pretty easy, and floors. For example, my bathroom modeling tutorial, if I can find it real quick. Here we go. You can see a lot of the objects in the scene are very basic. Like the table right here is basically just a cube. So unwrapping that was pretty easy, and the cylinders were very easy. The floor is just a giant plane. The soap bottles weren't even UV unwrapped. I just modified the shaders for specific faces to give kind of like a stripe effect. So yeah, there's a lot of ways you can work around it, but if you want to make game assets and you want to texture game assets, you need to properly UV unwrap your objects. So I think that's about it. I might have one more thing. No, that's about it. So yeah, so if you have any other questions about UV mapping and UV texturing, please leave them below. I kind of went on some side tangents during this video, but it's a very complex topic to cover if you're completely new to 3D. So hopefully I hope that you got something out of this. So yeah, thanks for watching. Please stick to Blender. It's a very great software. And once you get over the initial bumps, it's pretty easy to get used to. So thanks for watching, and please leave a comment down below if you have some constructive criticism.